There is a theory, whispered only among the oldest Force sensitives, those who spent centuries meditating in the deepest caves of worlds so remote that even the Empire's cartographers had given up trying to name them, that the Force is not alone, that the invisible energy binding all living things in this galaxy is merely one voice in a conversation so vast and so ancient that no single mind, human or otherwise, could ever hear the full sentence. They did not write this theory in holocrons. They did not share it with councils or emperors or anyone who might mistake wonder for weakness. They kept it to themselves, carved it into stone in languages no one remembered, and prayed quietly that whatever existed on the other side of that vast conversation would never decide to speak directly. On the night the sky above Lothal tore open, their prayers were answered with devastating finality. It began the way all catastrophes begin, without permission and without apology. Lieutenant Cass Aaron of the Imperial garrison on Lothal's eastern plateau had seen strange things in 6 years of service. She had watched a Jedi survivor dismantle an entire squadron with nothing but a lightsaber and focused intention. She had witnessed a rebel corvette execute a hyperspace jump so close to the planet's surface that the shockwave shattered half the garrison's eastern windows. She was not, by any reasonable measure, a woman who frightened easily. She frightened easily the moment she stepped outside for her evening perimeter check and found the sky bleeding. There was no other word for it. A wound had opened in the atmosphere approximately 4 kilometers above the grasslands. Not an explosion, not a starship's crash trajectory, not anything her 6 years of training had given her language to describe. It was a tear, a seam in the fabric of the sky itself, and from it poured light that had no right to exist in this corner of the galaxy. Liquid gold threaded through with silver, pulsing with the slow, deliberate rhythm of something alive. Around its edges, darkness gathered the way storm clouds gather before a hurricane, not moving toward the tear, but being pulled from it, spilling downward in long black tendrils that moved with horrible, patient intelligence towards the grasslands below. Every sensor in the garrison detonated into warning simultaneously. 17 different classification protocols cycled through the monitoring systems in under 5 seconds and failed every single one. The screens settled into the kind of blinking red uncertainty that Imperial engineers had designed as a last resort, the system's equivalent of throwing its hands up. Unknown, unknown, unknown. Aaron opened the emergency channel to the Star Destroyer Inexorable in high orbit, and with the admirable composure of someone who understood that panic was a luxury she could not currently afford, said simply, "We have a situation, priority 1, send it up the chain immediately." She was, in the tradition of all great Imperial understatements, telling the absolute truth. Rimuru Tempest hit the Lothal grasslands and left a crater, not a massive one. His magicule-reinforced body had absorbed the kinetic force of the dimensional transit before he fully stopped moving, but enough of one to send a ring of scorched earth spreading 30 meters in every direction from the point of his landing. He rolled, shifted his molecular composition instinctively to redistribute the remaining impact energy, and came upright in a single fluid motion that looked almost casual given that he had just been violently expelled from one reality into another. His gold-slitted eyes were already moving, already cataloging. Dimensional transit complete, Raphael. the evolved form of his great sage ability, the advisor whose intelligence surpassed any being Rimuru had ever encountered, spoke immediately inside his mind, cool and precise as always. Environmental assessment. Atmosphere breathable, oxygen-nitrogen composite within survivable parameters. Gravity nominal. Stellar configuration entirely unrecognized. Cross-referencing against all known star charts from Origin World and all adjacent dimensional layers previously catalogued. No matches. Conclusion. This is a previously uncontacted dimension with no known connection to our own reality or to the world of Middle-earth. Then how did the rift open here? Rimuru asked aloud, his voice quiet and measured in the way it always was when he was working through something genuinely dangerous. Unknown. The convergence that created the rift appears to have involved three distinct sources of dimensional energy simultaneously. Our own world's magical foundation, the One Ring's trans-dimensional corruptive power, and a third energy source native to this galaxy that we have not yet identified. The intersection of all three created a resonance cascade sufficient to breach the barriers between realities. Rimuru filed that away and turned a slow, complete circle to assess the full picture of his immediate situation. To the northeast, a cluster of hard white lights suggesting a military installation, angular and utilitarian in its design, surrounded by prefabricated structures that spoke of occupation rather than civilization. Something placed here by force of authority rather than grown from the ground up. Imperial, though he did not yet have that word. Above him, the rift was still open, still bleeding that terrible collision of golden light and encroaching shadow, and as he watched, shapes fell through it, not tumbling, not helplessly launched the way he had been, but descending with the deliberate, weightless patience of things that had never needed to fear falling because they had transcended the physical limitations that made falling dangerous. The Nazgul. He had known on some level that they would follow. The 9 ring wraiths, the kings of men reduced to screaming darkness by the slow, patient corruption of Sauron's rings, had been hunting the One Ring across Middle-earth when the rift opened. They would follow its pull through any barrier, across any distance into any reality. They existed for nothing else. But Middle-earth's Nazgul, terrible as they were, had been creatures sustained by Middle-earth's specific magical architecture. The rift had changed something. As the first ringwraith hit the Lothal grasslands 200 meters to his left, and the darkness around it exploded outward like ink dropped into water, Rimuru felt in his magicule network the unmistakable signature of amplification. Whatever the third energy source in this galaxy was, the one Raphael hadn't yet identified, it was feeding the Nazgul, actively, enthusiastically, the way oxygen feeds fire. Confirmed, Raphael said. The Ringwraith's shadow attribute energy is resonating with and being amplified by the ambient energy field of this galaxy. Estimated power increase, 300 to 400% above their Middle-earth baseline. Direct engagement is not currently recommended. So don't fight them, Rimuru said. Not yet. Additionally, the One Ring came through the rift. Its corruptive signal is already active and propagating. Distance estimate, approximately 6 kilometers northeast, moving in the direction of the military installation. Rimuru's eyes went very still. The One Ring loose in a military installation. He had absorbed enough knowledge about that object, through the accumulated memories of beings from worlds adjacent to Middle-earth, through Raphael's own analytical reconstruction of the ring's properties, to understand precisely how catastrophic that was. The ring did not need to be worn to corrupt. Its presence alone was sufficient to begin working on the minds around it, and it would instinctively seek the most powerful consciousness in its vicinity to use as a vessel. In a military installation full of soldiers operating on hierarchy and fear and absolute obedience to authority, the ring will locate the commander, Raphael confirmed, following his thought exactly, and begin the process of corruption immediately. High above him, a new shape entered the atmosphere. Not a creature, a ship, angular, predatory, descending with the focused speed of something that had a destination and a purpose and brooked absolutely no interference between itself and both. Military, powerful, and inside it, a presence that even Rimuru's formidable spiritual senses categorized with immediate instinctive caution. Dark the way a collapsed star is dark, not merely the absence of light, but the active consumption of it, controlled with an iron discipline that only made it more dangerous rather than less. Raphael processed it in 0.3 seconds. Unknown entity aboard descending vessel. Force attribute energy. This appears to be the third energy source native to this galaxy, now confirmed. This individual's connection to it is extraordinary. Caution strongly advised. Rimuru straightened his coat, verified his magicule reserves at 100% capacity, and looked up at the descending shuttle with the calm, analytical expression of a man who had faced true dragons and primordial demons and had walked away from all of them having learned something useful. "One thing at a time," he said quietly. "The ring first. Then whoever's in that ship." He began moving northeast at a pace that looked unhurried and covered ground at a rate that most vehicles would have found difficult to match. The scorched grass silent under his feet, the Nazgul screaming behind him in the alien night, and somewhere ahead of him, a corrupting golden object working its patient, ancient hunger on minds that had no framework whatsoever for understanding what was happening to them. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, or worlds beyond it, hit that subscribe button and drop a character's name in the comments below. May the Force be with you. Darth Vader felt it before he saw it. That was the nature of his relationship with the Force. After 20 years of the Emperor's training, of brutal immersion in the dark side's philosophies, of bleeding the light out of everything Anakin Skywalker had once been and replacing it with something harder and colder and more precise, Vader's Force sensitivity had become less like a sense and more like a second nervous system. It processed information faster than conscious thought. It told him things before his eyes confirmed them, and what it told him now as his shuttle descended through Lothal's atmosphere toward the glowing wound in the sky and the chaos spreading beneath it was something it had never told him before in 20 years of service. It told him, there is something here that the Force does not know how to name. That was, we invaders' considerable experience, the most dangerous category of thing in existence. The garrison was already in controlled chaos by the time his shuttle touched down. Imperials being sufficiently trained that even genuine terror expressed itself as organized, purposeful activity rather than the kind of screaming disorder that characterized lesser organizations. Soldiers were establishing a perimeter. Officers were coordinating sensor sweeps. A medical team had already begun treating the personnel who had suffered some form of psychic shock from the Nazgul's initial screaming descent, 3 of whom were unconscious and 2 of whom were simply sitting on the ground, staring at the middle distance with the specific expression of people whose minds had tried to process something they had no architecture to process and had politely refused. What drew Vader's attention most immediately was not the chaos. It was Commander Relic. The garrison commander was a decorated officer, 22 years of service, a man who had put down 2 rebel uprisings on 2 different systems and received commendations for both. He was standing at the center of the command post, with his hands clasped behind his back and the absolute stillness of someone who had achieved perfect calm, except the calm was wrong. The wrong temperature, the wrong texture. Vader had spent enough years in the Emperor's court to recognize the specific quality of stillness that was not serenity but submission. Relic's eyes had a golden tinge at their edges that had nothing to do with the light sources in the room. On the command table in front of him, partially wrapped in a piece of blast cloth that had clearly been placed there by someone else, and then unwrapped by Relic's own hands, sat a ring. Simple gold, unadorned, the kind of object that should have been entirely unremarkable. The Force recoiled from it the way living tissue recoils from a brand. Vader crossed the command post in 8 strides, reached past Relic, who did not react, did not flinch, simply watched with those wrong golden eyes, and closed his gauntleted hand around the blast cloth, wrapping the ring without touching it directly. Through the layered material, he could feel its influence pressing against even his considerable Force resistance, like a hand pressing against glass. Patient, confident, entirely certain it would eventually get through. "What is this?" he asked, not of Relic, who was clearly not currently available for useful conversation, but of the Force itself. The Force offered him the sensation of vast, cold hunger, ancient beyond any Sith artifact he had ever encountered, corrupting not through the dark side's philosophy, but through something adjacent to it, something that predated it, something that had been bending the will of kings and warriors to servitude long before the Sith had developed their first theory about passion and power. Vader secured the wrapped ring in a containment case that a terrified ensign brought at his gestured demand, noted that Relic's eyes were already clearing as the ring's proximity faded, and turned to face the viewport looking out over the eastern grasslands. The silver-haired figure was walking toward the garrison with his hands in his pockets. Rimuru had assessed the situation with the ring in approximately 40 seconds of observation from the garrison's outer perimeter, long enough for Raphael to confirm that the object had already begun corrupting the commander, long enough to watch the massive black-armored figure stride into the command post and remove it with the focused efficiency of someone who understood danger when they encountered it, and long enough to form a preliminary opinion about what kind of being he was dealing with. The individual who retrieved the ring demonstrates significant Force sensitivity, Raphael reported. Dark side dominant, power level extremely high. Behavioral indicators suggest military authority, disciplined aggression, and a specific orientation toward control and domination. He recognized the ring's danger immediately, which indicates either prior knowledge of similar artifacts or a level of Force perception that exceeds standard practitioners. He knew what he was looking at, Rimuru said quietly. Possibly, or he knew what he was feeling. The distinction may matter. It did matter, because it told Rimuru that this was not an enemy who would be blindsided by the nature of the threat they were all facing, whatever else the black-armored figure was. And Rimuru had significant reservations about the category of being that wore that specific combination of armor, breathing apparatus, and controlled darkness. He was not ignorant. That made him potentially useful. It also made him significantly more dangerous than someone who would simply attack without understanding what they were attacking. Rimuru walked through the garrison's outer gate at a pace that invited challenge without seeking it, the particular gait of someone with nothing to prove but also nothing to hide. The two soldiers who moved to intercept him found themselves gently but absolutely redirected by a thought acceleration-enhanced application of magicule pressure that left them standing slightly confused about why they had moved to a different position without being entirely certain when they had decided to do so. He stepped past them without breaking stride and entered the command post. Vader was waiting. The dark side radiated from him in waves that Rimuru's magicule network registered as genuine, significant, and entirely distinct from anything he had previously catalogued. Not malevolent in the petty way, not the darkness of something that hated for pleasure, but the darkness of something that had made a deliberate philosophical choice to seek power through domination rather than through the slower, messier path of cooperation and growth. Rimuru had known beings who made that choice before. He understood the logic of it, even while disagreeing with it fundamentally. He also noticed, with the careful attention he paid to all details that might become relevant in the next few minutes, that Vader had not yet ignited the red blade at his hip. Observation before confrontation, intelligent. "You removed the ring," Rimuru said, in the common galactic tongue that Raphael had already begun deconstructing and reconstructing from ambient linguistic data with remarkable speed. The grammar was approximate. He knew it sounded slightly wrong, but it was functional. That was the correct decision. The breathing apparatus cycled. The black helmet tilted fractionally. "You know what it is. I know what it does, which is more immediately relevant." Rimuru's gold eyes moved briefly to the containment case on the table. "It will not be contained by that for long. Whatever materials you used, they are not sufficient. The object's influence is not electromagnetic. It does not respond to physical barriers. Then what does contain it? Distance or destruction?" He paused. Destruction is significantly harder than it sounds. Vader was silent for a moment, the particular silence of someone recalibrating their approach. "You came through the rift with the shadow creatures." "Through the same rift," Rimuru corrected carefully, because the distinction mattered enormously. "Not with them. They followed the ring. I followed the rift because the rift took me. These are different categories of arrival with different implications for what I intend to do next." "And what do you intend to do next?" Outside, the Nazgul screamed. 3 separate voices, each one a sound that had no business existing in a physical universe, harmonizing into something that made the garrison's walls vibrate and sent 2 more soldiers to the ground with their hands over their ears. The darkness outside the viewports deepened in a way that had nothing to do with the position of Lothal's moons. Rimuru kept his eyes on Vader. "Survive the next 6 hours," he said. "After that, I am open to discussion." For a long moment, the only sound was the mechanical rhythm of the breathing apparatus and the distant screaming of things that had crossed impossible distances to bring their darkness to a new world. Then Vader said, "The Emperor will want you." "Many people have wanted things from me," Rimuru replied pleasantly. "The ones who tried to take them without asking had universally poor outcomes." Another silence. The containment case on the table began to emit a faint golden glow along its sealed edges, pressing at the gaps with patient, ancient hunger. Vader looked at the case, then at Rimuru, then at the viewport where the shadows were thickening. "Tell me about the shadow creatures," he said. Rimuru allowed himself a very small, very precise smile. Not yet an alliance, not yet trust, but the beginning of the only thing more powerful than either. A shared problem that neither of them could solve alone. "Sit down," he said. "This will take a moment." It was the rebel cell on Lothal that complicated everything. They had been operating out of a system of underground tunnels 3 kilometers south of the garrison for 11 days. A small unit, 7 operatives led by a woman named Senna Voss, who had the compact, watchful energy of someone who had survived entirely too many situations through pure stubbornness. Their mission had been simple: gather intelligence on the Imperial garrison's munitions inventory, transmit coordinates to Alliance High Command, and extract before anyone noticed they had been there. 11 days of careful observation, 11 days of patience and discipline, and exactly the kind of quiet, professional competence that kept rebel operatives alive in a galaxy that wanted them dead. Then the sky had split open, and the Nazgul had arrived. Senna Voss had looked at her second-in-command, Torin, a former Imperial signals officer who had defected 3 years ago and still wore the posture of someone who had been told to stand straight so many times it had become permanent, and said with magnificent understatement, "Change of plans." They were watching the garrison through electro-binoculars from a ridge 200 meters out when the silver-haired stranger walked through the outer gate without being stopped, and Torin, who had calibrated his binoculars to maximum sensitivity, said very quietly, "He walked through a repulsor barrier like it wasn't there." "I see that," Senna said. "The barrier that stops blaster fire. I see that too. And the 2 sentries just let him in." "Torin, yes? Stop telling me things I can see with my own eyes and start telling me something useful." The Nazgul moved at midnight. Rimuru had anticipated it, the Ringwraith's tactical pattern, and they were tactical in the patient, single-minded way that beings with no individual will and one collective purpose could be tactical. Was always the same: wait for the darkness to deepen, assess the strength of whatever stood between them and the ring, and then move with the full combined weight of their corrupting power behind them. They had waited long enough. The ring's golden glow was visible through the garrison's walls now, pressing through the containment case's seams like something breathing. It was calling to them. They were answering. The first Ringwraith cleared the garrison's outer perimeter in a movement that bypassed every physical barrier through the simple expedient of not being entirely physical. The blasters of the garrison's perimeter guards discharged uselessly through shadow. The sensor arrays tracked the disturbance and registered nothing they could interpret. 3 soldiers simply collapsed as the Nazgul passed through them. Not dead, not injured in any way the medical droid could immediately identify, but emptied, hollowed, like vessels from which something had been poured out. Vader was already moving, the red blade ignited with a snap hiss that cut the darkness of the command post and painted everything crimson. He and Rimuru, who had been leaning against the far wall studying a tactical readout that Raphael was simultaneously translating and analyzing, straightened immediately, magicule network surging to full combat readiness in the same instant. 9 ringwraiths incoming, Raphael updated. All 9. Simultaneous approach vectors from multiple directions. This is a coordinated assault rather than opportunistic attack. They are significantly more organized in this amplified state than their Middle-earth baseline behavior would suggest. The Force is making them smarter, Rimuru said. More precisely, the dark side energy of this galaxy is supplementing their collective will with a degree of tactical coherence they do not normally possess. They are not merely following the ring's signal, they are hunting. The Vader swept through the door of the command post into the corridor beyond, and for half a second he and Rimuru were moving in parallel. Not together, not coordinated, simply 2 entities heading towards the same threat from the same point of origin, which was a different thing, and both of them understood that. The first ringwraith materialized in the corridor ahead of them, up close in the confined space of an Imperial garrison hallway. The physical reality of what a Nazgul was in its amplified state was considerably more immediate than it had appeared at 400 meters of observation distance. The shadow was not merely visual. It pressed against the senses, against awareness itself. A cold, wet darkness that carried in it the accumulated weight of 9 men's complete and total subjugation of every individual quality they had ever possessed. It did not look like a creature. It looked like what happens to a creature when a greater will consumes everything that makes it itself and leaves only service. Vader's lightsaber cut through the leading edge of the ringwraith's shadow form, and the creature recoiled, not destroyed, not even significantly harmed, but reactive in a way that confirmed Rimuru's earlier hypothesis. The Force energy in the blade interacted with the shadow attribute in a way that caused genuine disruption, not lethal, but painful in whatever way a being sustained entirely by dark will could experience pain. Noted, Raphael said. The Force-infused plasma blade disrupts the ringwraith's shadow attribute cohesion, not sufficient for destruction but sufficient for displacement, combined with high-density magicule attack. I know, Rimuru said, and hit the ringwraith with a compression of pure magicule energy that took the shape of his fist and struck with the force of a collapsing building. The ringwraith detonated sideways through the corridor wall, leaving a shadow-shaped hole in the durasteel that slowly filled back in with darkness as the entity began reassembling itself 30 meters away. Vader turned to look at him, just briefly, just for half a second. Rimuru met the look with calm gold eyes and said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. Either they were going to manage this together or they were going to fail separately. And the result of failure was a garrison full of hollowed soldiers, a one-ring loose in a new galaxy with no understanding of what it was, and 9 amplified ringwraiths with Force-enhanced tactical coherence working systematically through a planet's population. Vader turned back toward the reassembling ringwraith and said, in a tone that contained absolutely no warmth and also, notably, no further objection, "We take them apart individually, drive them into groups of 2, separate and disrupt." "Agreed," Rimuru said. It was not trust, it was not alliance, It was the specific, pragmatic clarity of two extremely powerful beings who had independently arrived at the same tactical conclusion through the same logical process, and were adult enough to act on the logic rather than the discomfort. They moved. The rebel cell arrived at exactly the wrong moment and exactly the right one. Senna Voss had made the decision to breach the garrison's south perimeter based on two factors. First, that the garrison's entire complement of personnel was currently occupied with shadow creatures that blasters couldn't stop, and that therefore the south perimeter was probably the least monitored it had ever been. Second, that whatever was happening inside those walls was going to make every piece of intelligence she had gathered in the last 11 days obsolete unless she updated it immediately. She got through the perimeter with 4 of her 7. Torin, a demolition specialist named Breck, a pilot called Maris, and a combat medic whose name was technically Sergeant Olav, but whom everyone called Doc. The other 3 held the extraction route. What they found in the garrison's interior was not what any of them had expected, which was impressive given that the bar for unexpected had been raised dramatically by the evening's previous events. The silver-haired figure was fighting 3 ringwraiths simultaneously in the garrison's central courtyard, and he was doing it while simultaneously tracking the positions of the other 6 through what appeared to be some form of sensory ability that let him perceive things without looking directly at them. And he was also apparently having a conversation with himself, or with something inside himself, that was guiding his tactical decisions in real time. The black-armored figure was 40 meters away, handling a separate pair of ringwraiths, with a red lightsaber and what Torin could only describe as terrifyingly efficient violence. "That's Darth Vader," Torin said. "I see that," Senna said. "We need to leave. We need to help." A beat. "We need to help Darth Vader. We need to help the person fighting alongside Darth Vader against those shadow things, and Vader happens to also be there." Senna was already moving, blaster up. "Shoot the shadows, avoid the man in the helmet, don't touch anything gold, and do not under any circumstances go near that containment case in the command post." "How do you know about the containment case?" "Because there's something in there that I can feel from here, and I have been a rebel for 5 years. Which means I have excellent instincts about things that want to control people." She was not force-sensitive, but some warnings did not require the force, and some warnings were simply the accumulated wisdom of being human and alive in a dangerous universe and paying attention to what that universe was trying to tell you. They opened fire on the shadows, and the Nazgul, who had not expected resistance from this direction, turned, and that was the opening Rimuru needed. He hit all 3 with a concentrated burst of magicule energy, so dense it briefly illuminated the entire courtyard in silver-white light, scattering the ringwraith's shadow forms in all directions. And in the 3 seconds of their disorientation, Vader swept through from the east and drove force-enhanced strikes through the nearest one's center mass with a precise sequence of lightsaber strikes that Rimuru's Raphael-assisted perception cataloged as extraordinarily technically proficient. 7 down, 2 remaining. See, the last 2 ringwraiths did something unexpected. They stopped. They consolidated, drew together, merged their shadow forms into a single entity twice the size of either individual, pulsing with golden light from the ring's influence propagating outward from the containment case. And from the merged darkness, a voice emerged that was not a Nazgul's scream. It was older, colder, more deliberate, found, it said, in a frequency that bypassed ears entirely and spoke directly to consciousness, the one who can consume all things. Demon Lord, Slime, the great devourer. Rimuru went very still. You were meant to cross, the voice continued, the voice of Sauron's fragmentary consciousness, the piece of the Dark Lord's will that had survived the rift. Not the ring, not the wraiths. You, the vessel who absorbs everything he touches. Imagine what you could carry. Imagine what you could become if you carried me. The darkness pressed against Rimuru's magicule network, the way the One Ring had pressed against Vader's force resistance. Patient, certain, ancient. And Rimuru felt, for the first time since arriving in this galaxy, something that required genuine effort to manage. Not fear, something more specific than fear. The recognition that the thing pressing against him was not bluffing about what it could offer, because it had bent 9 kings of men to nothing, and it had been building toward this specific moment since before the rift opened, and it was very, very good at finding the exact shape of what a person most deeply wanted and offering it in the most persuasive possible terms. You could absorb a god, Sauron's fragment whispered, and finally, truly, to have no limit at all. Raphael said nothing. For the first time Rimuru could remember, Raphael said nothing, and that silence was its own kind of answer, because what Sauron was offering was not nothing, and Raphael, who calculated everything, had calculated the genuine cost of this moment and chosen to let Rimuru make this choice entirely on his own. The silence lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Rimuru Tempest stood in the courtyard of an imperial garrison on a planet he had never heard of, in a galaxy he had arrived in approximately 6 hours ago, with Darth Vader 10 meters to his left, holding a crimson lightsaber, and 4 rebel soldiers behind him, holding their breath, and considered the offer of a dark god with the same careful, methodical attention he gave every significant decision in his life. He thought about what Sauron was offering. He did not dismiss it. He had learned through the process of becoming what he was, through every absorption, every adaptation, every moment of choosing to grow rather than to stop, that the most dangerous temptations were the ones that were genuinely, authentically appealing. The offer of unlimited power was not appealing to Rimuru because he was a slime who had forgotten what it felt like to want things. It was not appealing because he was naive enough to believe that power had no value. It was appealing because it was real, because Sauron's fragment contained genuine power, because absorbing it would in fact expand Rimuru's capacity in ways that Raphael's models confirmed were significant. And it was not appealing enough, because Rimuru had built a nation, had watched beings he cared about grow and change and become more than they had been, had understood through the long, patient work of governance and community, and choosing cooperation over domination at every significant fork in the road. That power accumulated through absorption was still lesser than power built through connection. Sauron had bent 9 kings to nothing. Rimuru had made a federation of beings who had chosen freely to stand beside him. There was no version of this offer that was worth trading one for the other. No, he said, and then, because the moment called for something more than a single word, he added, I have absorbed things far older than you, things with more claim to divinity than a dark lord with a jewelry fixation. What they gave me was their strength. What you would give me is your limitation, and you have been defeated before." He let that land. By a hobbit, the merged shadow form pulsed with rage. Raphael, who had been silent for those 4 seconds, spoke now with the crisp efficiency of an advisor who had made their peace with the decision and moved immediately to implementation. "Predator is ready. The binding architecture of the shadow form's merged state creates a single point of vulnerability at its core. One absorption attempt, maximum intensity, targeting the core consciousness rather than the shadow attribute material surrounding it. If successful." "I know," Rimuru said, "and if it fails, then we try something else." A pause. "I have 17 contingency options prepared." 17. I thought the situation warranted thoroughness. Rimuru almost smiled. He looked at Vader, who was watching the exchange with the intensity of someone who could not hear one half of the conversation, but was following the other half with considerable attention. "When I move forward," he said, "the shadow form will expand outward as a defensive reaction. But it will attempt to consume everything within a 20-meter radius." Vader's helmet tilted fractionally. "And you need me to drive it back inward, force the expansion back toward the center, whatever that red blade does to shadow attribute energy. It disrupts the cohesion. If you can prevent the expansion from taking hold, I contain it," Vader said. "You absorb it." Approximately. The breathing apparatus cycled. Another fractional pause that Rimuru was beginning to read as Vader's version of a contemplative silence. Then, "The Emperor would consider this galaxy's most significant threat." "The Emperor," Rimuru said carefully, "is not here." A pause that lasted precisely long enough to confirm that Vader had both heard and understood the implications of that observation. "Move on your signal," Vader said. Rimuru moved. He crossed the distance between himself and the merged shadow form in a movement that pushed his physical capabilities to their upper limit, not the absolute maximum he was capable of, which would have created a shockwave sufficient to level the garrison, but fast enough that the shadow form's reaction time, even amplified by Force Dark energy and Sauron's fragmentary will, was not fast enough to prepare an adequate defense before he was inside its perimeter. Predator activated. The experience of attempting to absorb Sauron's consciousness was unlike anything Rimuru had absorbed before, not because it was stronger than the things he had previously consumed. He had absorbed true dragons, had taken the essence of beings that made Sauron's fragment look like a candle beside a star. But because of its specific nature, Sauron's power was not raw strength, it was will. Bending, shaping, enslaving will that had spent millennia perfecting the single skill of making other things into extensions of itself. The moment Predator made contact with the core consciousness, it pushed back, not with power but with personality, pressing against Rimuru's identity the way the ring pressed against the minds of its bearers, looking for the seam, looking for the crack, looking for the specific place where Rimuru Tempest ended and something that could be reshaped began. It found nothing, because Rimuru Tempest had been reshaped repeatedly, fundamentally. He had gone from human salaryman to slime, to demon lord, to true dragon vessel, to something that Raphael's categorization systems had eventually simply labeled undefined, not because he was incomplete, but because he had so thoroughly integrated every transformation he had undergone that there was no seam between them. There was no Rimuru before and Rimuru after. There was only Rimuru, continuous and whole through every change, and that wholeness was the most absolute defense against an entity whose entire method of conquest was finding the distance between who someone was and who they feared they might become. Sauron's fragment found no distance, found no fear, found only someone who had already become everything he was going to become and was entirely comfortable with it. Predator consumed it, not gently, not cleanly. The shadow form exploded outward exactly as Rimuru had predicted, a wave of pure dark attribute shadow energy radiating in all directions, with enough force to crack the garrison's courtyard floor in a pattern of black lines spreading 30 meters in every direction. Vader was already moving, the crimson blade a continuous arc of motion, the force bending around him like a physical thing, driving the expanding shadow back inward with controlled, precise strikes that cut the expansion into sections and collapsed each section toward the center. The rebel soldiers hit the ground. Senevos, to her considerable credit, had her people down and shielded before the shockwave fully propagated, Torrin's arm across the back of the demolition specialist. All four of them pressed against the garrison wall, with their weapons pointed skyward in the specific posture of people who have made the professional assessment that this particular moment calls for keeping your head down rather than firing. The shadow collapsed inward. Vader drove it. Rimuru consumed it. The last of the ring wraiths, de-amplified now, their sustaining consciousness gone, their connection to Sauron's will severed, dissolved, not dramatically, not with screaming or light. They simply became less present, the way a projection ceases when its source is switched off. The shadows fading from solid to transparent to nothing, leaving behind in the cold Lothal air only the faint echo of 9 human lives reduced to service and then finally, at last, released from it. Rimuru stood at the center of the courtyard in the sudden silence and processed. Absorption complete, Raphael reported. Sauron's fragmentary consciousness has been fully integrated, analyzing contents. A pause, longer than Raphael's analyses usually ran. This is extensive. The accumulated knowledge of the Dark Lord's entire history of conquest, his understanding of ringcraft, of the bending of wills, of the forging of power into physical objects. All of it is now catalogued. Can the ring be destroyed from here? With the knowledge now available to us, yes. With access to sufficient heat and the correct application of magicule-reinforced compression, the ring's physical structure can be disrupted in a way that the conventional methods of Middle-earth could not achieve. The fires of Mount Doom worked because of a specific interaction between Sauron's will and the ring's construction. That will no longer exist. Good, Rimuru said. Then we deal with it here. The rift closed 40 minutes later. Rimuru stood on the roof of the garrison and directed the accumulated knowledge of Sauron's absorbed consciousness toward the dimensional wound in Lothal's sky, combining it with his own understanding of dimensional architecture, learned from his world's gods and demons and the various beings who had ripped holes in reality for various purposes over the years, and closed the seam with the kind of precise, controlled application of power that looked from the ground like nothing more dramatic than a silvery shimmer spreading outward from his outstretched hand until the bleeding light and shadow simply stopped. The sky was dark and clean and full of unfamiliar stars. The One Ring was gone, reduced to nothing by a 30-second application of compressed magicule energy that had generated temperatures sufficient to vaporize the Beskar-reinforced containment case along with it, leaving a clean circle of fused courtyard floor and no trace of the object's existence except the fading resonance of its absence in the force, which even Rimuru's non-force senses could detect as something like a held breath slowly being released. He sat on the garrison rooftop for a moment and was simply still. The rift was closed. From his side, he had not checked during the process of closing it whether there was a way to reopen it from this end, whether the dimensional mechanics of this galaxy, so different from his own, I offered any path back to the Rimuru Tempest Federation, to Benimaru and Shion and Shuna, and the nation he had spent years building with his own hands and his own choices, and the accumulated trust of people who had decided he was worth following. Raphael was quiet, which was its own answer. "How long?" Rimuru asked. "Unknown. The dimensional architecture of this galaxy operates on principles that will require significant study before any reliable estimate can be made. What I can confirm is that the path home is not currently accessible from this location. He was stranded in a galaxy at war with itself, governed by an empire that had already attempted to acquire him, observed by a rebellion that didn't trust him, and orbited by a star destroyer whose commander had cooperated with him for exactly as long as the situation required cooperation, and would now have to decide what the Emperor wanted done about the most powerful non-force entity the galaxy had ever encountered. He heard boots on the roof access ladder. Senevos climbed through the hatch with the compact efficiency of someone who had decided that extreme caution and extreme directness were not mutually exclusive. She had her blaster holstered, a specific and intentional signal, and she looked at Rimuru with the frank, appraising eyes of someone who made survival-critical assessments of people for a living. "You closed the rift," she said. "Yes." "And the shadow things are gone." "Yes." "And whatever was in the containment case, also gone." She was quiet for a moment. Below them in the garrison, Vader had already retreated to his shuttle. No final words, no negotiation, no explicit statement of future intentions. The shuttle had lifted off 12 minutes after the last ringwraith dissolved, climbing into the night with the focused inevitability of a message already composed and already being transmitted to a recipient who would not appreciate its contents. Rimuru had watched it go without attempting to stop it, because stopping it would have required revealing exactly how much of his capacity he had spent on the rift closure, and more importantly, because letting Vader go, letting him carry the report of what had happened here to whoever waited for it, was its own kind of message. "I am here. I know you know I am here. Come find me if you want to have that conversation." "You have nowhere to go," Senna said, not unkindly. "Currently, no. And you're not Imperial." "Emphatically not." She looked at the stars for a moment, then at him. "We have a ship, 2 days out from here at hyperspace. It's not much. It's honestly embarrassing how not much it is. But it goes places, and the people on the other end of it are trying to do something worth doing." She paused. "I'm not asking you to join anything. I'm offering you a direction." Rimuru considered her for a long moment. The accumulated knowledge of Sauron's consciousness sat quiet and fully integrated within him, a vast, dark library he would spend years cataloging and choosing what to do with. The knowledge of this galaxy's force, partially reverse-engineered through Raphael's analysis of Vader's combat techniques, and the Nazgul's amplification. He was already being modeled and mapped. He was stranded, yes. He was also, by any reasonable assessment, precisely as capable of navigating this galaxy as he had been of navigating his own, which was to say, entirely capable, with the caveat that everything would take longer than ideal and involve more complications than expected. "A direction," he said. "That's all I'm offering." He stood up from the rooftop's edge and straightened his coat. The elegant black and silver that had survived two-dimensional transitions and the attempted possession of a Dark Lord without a scratch, and looked at the unfamiliar stars of a galaxy that had not asked for him and was going to have to figure out what to do with him anyway. "Then let's go," he said, "before whoever was in that shuttle sends something larger." In the weeks that followed the Battle of Lothal's eastern garrison, as the event was eventually recorded in both Imperial intelligence files and Rebel Alliance debrief transcripts, two accounts so different in tone and conclusion that a reader encountering them in sequence might question whether they described the same reality. The galaxy began the slow process of understanding what had changed. Emperor Palpatine reviewed Vader's report 3 times, then reviewed it a 4th time, paying particular attention to the section concerning the silver-haired entity's ability to absorb and integrate the consciousness of an ancient dark god without corruption, destabilization, or any apparent cost to his own identity. Wei then sat in the dark of his throne room on Coruscant for a very long time, thinking thoughts that he shared with no one. The Rebel Alliance received Senevos's transmission from the coordinates she was not yet authorized to share, and forwarded it immediately to Mon Mothma, who read the relevant sections twice and then looked at General Dodonna with an expression that combined profound uncertainty with something that, in a different context, might have been called hope. And somewhere in the outer rim, aboard a ship that had seen better decades but was still flying and still mattered to the people inside it, Rimuru Tempest sat cross-legged in the cargo hold, while Raphael ran models on hyperspace theory, and Torin explained the basics of galactic politics with the slightly apologetic tone of someone aware that he was giving a briefing on a subject that had no good news anywhere in it. He listened. He learned. He filed every detail away with the quiet, patient thoroughness that had always been his greatest advantage. Not the raw power, not the absorption ability, not the intelligence of Raphael's perfect analysis, but the willingness to start from nothing and build one piece of understanding at a time until the shape of a new world became clear enough to navigate. The force which had been watching him since his first step on Lothal's grass turned its ancient attention toward this new and nameless presence in its midst and found, for the first time in a very long time, something it could not categorize, something that was neither dark nor light but simply, fundamentally itself. The galaxy had survived the opening of the rift. It had survived the Nazgul. It had survived the One Ring and the fragment of Sauron and the first collision of 3 realities, pressed too close together by the accident of dimensional mechanics and the ambition of ancient darkness. What it had not yet survived, what it was only beginning to understand it would need to reckon with, was the slime that had walked through all of it and come out the other side with everything it had learned and nothing it hadn't chosen to keep. The real work, Rimuru thought, watching hyperspace stream past the viewport in rivers of blue-white light, was just beginning. The galaxy was not the same galaxy it had been before the night the sky tore open above Lothal. In the deepest archives of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, the ones the Empire had not managed to fully purge, hidden in a sub-level that even the Inquisitors had never located, a record existed of a Force phenomenon with no accepted name. The wound between worlds, the seam where realities pressed too close. Jedi scholars across generations had debated whether it was myth or doctrine, whether the Force truly connected all things across all possible realities, or whether that was poetry mistaken for prophecy. Rimuru Tempest was not proof of either interpretation. He was not Force-sensitive. He had not arrived through prophecy or destiny, or the will of any light side power that any Jedi would have recognized as such. He had arrived because three sources of power had collided at the wrong angle in the wrong moment, and the galaxy had been unprepared for all three. It was not prepared for what came next either. But then the galaxy rarely was. Somewhere in Imperial intelligence, a dossier was growing. Somewhere in the Rebel Alliance, a conversation about an unprecedented asset was beginning. Somewhere in the Outer Rim, a ship carrying 7 soldiers and one impossibly capable being from another world was making its way toward coordinates that represented the rebellion's next best chance. And in the Force itself, in the vast, living current that connected every living thing in this galaxy and perhaps in others, something had shifted. A new note had entered the chord, something that was not dark and not light and was entirely, irreducibly itself. The galaxy had a great deal left to discover about Rimuru Tempest. So, for that matter, did he. May the Force be with you. More stories await.